Okay, my name is Joe Gottlieb, and the title of my paper is Psychological Impediments to Collective Space Colonization. Given time constraints, this is going to be more of an advertisement for a paper, but I hope what I say will give you the gist of it. So I want to begin by distinguishing three types of impediments to space colonization. So by space colonization, I mean self-sustaining colonies beyond low Earth orbit. And in this respect, we can distinguish between three kinds of barriers to space colonization. First off, we have what I'll call physical impediments. So physical impediments are impediments that are a function of minding independent facts about the world and its underlying nature. For example, whether there is water available on the target. The second impediment is technological. Technological impediments assume that the physical barriers are met, so there is in fact water wherever you're trying to colonize, but then we have to ask whether we have the requisite technological know-how and prowess to pursue space colonization. So in this case, it would be whether we could in fact access the water, which presumably would be necessary for the space colony. Finally, there are psychological impediments. And these are impediments whose sources reside in our mental dispositions and preferences. These do not include, for my purposes, something like depression, right? So depression due to being far from home, because this is not an impediment to space colonization as such. Rather, this is an impediment to space colonization going well for the colonists. My focus here is going to be on psychological impediments. In particular, I have two in mind. First, our tendency towards steep positive discounting, and second, our tendency towards free riding and buck passing. There are a few provisos worth noting here. First, the rationality of these tendencies are going to be irrelevant for our purposes. Second, we should admit that there are evolutionary grounds for example, steep positive discounting, but this too will be irrelevant because there is a difference between the evolutionary explanation for why we have a psychological trait and our reasoning for acting in accordance with that trait. Finally, it need not be the case that all people exhibit these tendencies. What matters for my point is that most people do. Here, then, is my thesis. I'll argue that our tendency towards steep positive discounting and our tendency towards free riding and buck passing constitute particularly strong barriers to collective space colonization that cannot easily be assuaged by standard countermeasures. Here, too, we also need some provisos. First, the term particularly is significant. These tendencies are not unique to space colonization, but I'll suggest that they are especially pernicious in this context. Second, collective is likewise significant. My argument will only apply to space colonization by states in which ordinary people have shared responsibility for choosing legislation, so something like a direct or representative democracy. Finally, I am focused on space colonization as a hedge against existential risk. This third point requires a little bit more elaboration. So by existential risk, I mean a threat to humanity's long-term potential, either through literal extinction or civilizational collapse. Now, there's a somewhat intuitive and straightforward argument for space colonization as a hedge against existential risk. The basic core idea here is that the more dispersed humans are in the solar system, the harder it will be for most risks to wipe us out. Of course, this straightforward reasoning does have complications. So for one thing, we'd want to know about risk correlation, and we also want to know about cost-benefit analysis. That is, whether there are other projects we might take on that would be better for, on a cost-benefit analysis, would be better for protecting against existential risks. Now, I am optimistic about these issues. In any event, given time constraints, I'm not going to talk about them here. My point is that if we think protecting humanity's long-term future is of deep moral importance, and that space colonization is one of the most important things we can do to protect our future, then it follows, if I'm right, that one of the most important things we can do, simpliciter, suffers insuperable difficulties when undertaken collectively. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about these impediments. I'm going to just focus on hyperbolic discounting to give you a sense of what I'm after. So it's well known that we exhibit temporal bias towards the near, and this can take two forms. One form is pretty familiar. It's a intrapersonal near bias. More relevant for our purposes is intergenerational near bias. And on intergenerational near bias, an agent S is biased toward the near with respect to benefits to future generations if and only if for two exclusive future benefits, B1 and B2, where B2 is at least as good as B1, S prefers B1 because it would occur near to the present. Now, as it's framed here, I'm assuming a time preference model of trade-offs concerning future generations, which itself assumes a symmetry between hedonic and non-hedonic value. That's questionable, but we can safely set that aside here because it won't matter to my argument. Now, this point about intergenerational near bias has a deep impact on how we value future generations, because it comes to our assigning a positive discount rate to future well-being. And what that means is that X amount of our well-being here and now is worth more than that same amount of future well-being for future people. And the higher discount rate we assign to future well-being, the lesser we will feel obliged to consider the future when making present decisions. And this admits of straightforward mathematical analysis. So if you just have, say, a 5% discount rate, things get pretty interesting after enough time, right? So here's what it looks like after 100 years, right? We end up with just a fraction of 1% of what we started with, right? So these can be quite steep. So I think it should be fairly clear how this applies to space colonization when done to mitigate existential risks. And so we can illustrate this just simply by considering two examples, right? So two different projects one might undertake. So on one project, right, involving climate change mitigation strategies that might provide a moderate benefit to our children, and then we can compare that with another project involving the establishment of, say, a Martian colonization infrastructure, which provide a large benefit to those live in 5 generations, right? So we have option one, right, spending $75 billion that will save 1,000 people this year versus spending $50 billion to save 20,000 people in 75 years. At a 5% discount rate, we would very quickly plump for option one. Why? Well, because the death in 75 years will only be 2.13% as significant as a death today. Now, I haven't talked about free riding or buck passing, but it's clear that all of these things, discounting, free riding, buck passing, are not unique in their application to space colonization. So you might wonder, why exactly is there a special problem here? Well, I do obviously think there is a special problem. I think these impediments are pretty tough to overcome. So I want to begin by looking at co-benefits. Right? So you might hear all this and just say, look, like anything operating on long time scales, space colonization will be a hard sell. Right? But all that means is that we should not try to sell space colonization as a hedge against existential risk, even if, in fact, that is why we're ultimately pursuing it. Rather, what we should do is try to sell space colonization in terms of its near-term co-benefits, right? We would piggyback, as it were, space colonization off these other things. Now, there's different ways of cashing this out. So you might do it in terms of asteroid mining or helium-3 mining, right, on the moon or something like that. But I don't think the co-benefit strategy is apt, right? So the basic worry here is that large-scale helium-3 extraction does not require space colonization. It only requires space exploration and perhaps, say, a small manned lunar outpost. And this, even if it did require a small manned lunar outpost, this falls well short of the kind of space colonization that would be required to be a meaningful hedge against a global catastrophic risk. And that's really important because what it does is it underscores that the gulf between a helium-3 mining operation and space colonization appropriate for existential risk is really quite large, both in terms of the money required and the time required to complete the lunar colony once the basic mining infrastructure is in place. And if that's right, we can easily imagine the very same discounting trade-offs being operative even once that infrastructure for the mining is there. Right? So the benefit of being protected from existential risks will still accrue in the far future, and that must be weighed against more near-term benefits, like, for instance, spending more money on building further mining infrastructure. And I don't think this is unique to the example, like the same thing I think would apply to asteroid mining. So the general point is just that absent a short-term co-benefit that requires eventual space colonization, or at least is made substantially easier by space colonization, the co-benefits move is not going to really help. Okay, the next point is sheer timescales. So to mitigate against existential risks, this space colony must be self-sustaining. But it can't be minimally self-sustaining because that would not be enough for existential risk mitigation. It would not help to have a colony which, while technically self-sustaining, is constantly on the edge of total collapse. So we need to think then about how exactly big the colony should be. I think a reasonable estimate is in fact quite large. It should be around 1 million people, because that's about the size of a medium city. It approximates the size of a moderately large city, I should say, which is itself a reasonable approximation of the minimum amount of positive productivity that would be required for a colony to be an effective and so stable hedge against existential risks. Now, how long would it take to build up a colony of 1 million people? Well, there are many factors involved, but clearly, right, if the colony is going to be self-sustaining, it must be able to produce its own food. And just along that dimension, just for food production, it's been estimated that it would take a minimum of 100 years. And this really does not bode well, given our near-term temporal bias. The final point I want to make here concerns looking to the past. Okay, so we might say that, look, despite these sort of psychological impediments, the past gives us hope for the future, right? After all, mankind has undertaken many collective projects with long time horizons. And you might think that provides us a reason to believe that space colonization will, at least eventually, come to be by collective means. I think in this vein, there are two things that are somewhat instructive. So you might think of, say, St. Peter's Basilica and the Apollo program. The Apollo program obviously was not about space colonization, but it does provide somewhat of a template of a space-based project that took a while that we can then extend to think about this. Now, with respect to St. Peter's Basilica, it took 120 years to finish. So it was an intergenerational project. So it is germane in that way. But it wasn't intergenerational in the relevant sense. And this is because relevant where, say, discounting would be operative. And this is because cathedrals in the Roman Catholic tradition are meant to be monuments to God, a being who, if you buy into a theistic ontology, was there from the cathedral's very inception. So in a way, the point was not entirely the cathedral's full realization. It was, in large part, the very act of building the cathedral as a form of worship. So it's reasonable to interpret the project participants as being more responsive to near-term benefits, for instance, the joy gained from performing an act of worship to a present God, than long-term ones. Finally, with respect to the Apollo program, this point is more complex, and we could talk about this in the fuller conference, but I think that if you look at the funding rates and the public opinions and the geopolitical context which the Apollo program was operating, what you see is disparities between public opinion and funding rates that is exactly what you would expect, given what we've been saying. Right? Because really, the reason people did it was for a present concern. Right? The point was to beat the USSR to the moon, and once we did that, people cared a lot less and funding dropped. Now, of course, there's more to the story, but the core point here is that it is no comfort if we pursue existential risk mitigation only when our back's against the wall, right? So we don't, for those who have rang the alarm on existential risks, the hope for them is that the mitigation efforts are done before it's too late. That is, before the threats are knocking on our doorstep, so to speak, right? So if an asteroid were to hit Earth, we should watch from a fully colonized Mars, not while in transit from the first colonization ships, right? So I don't think this sort of historical analogy provides any comfort for people trying to get over these impediments. Now, my thesis is, of course, to some extent pessimistic, but it's not entirely pessimistic because it only applies to democratic, or what I'm calling collective, attempts at space colonization. And the reason it's hard for them, right, is because the elected officials are to some extent beholden to their constituents. And if most people have these, say, discount rates, right, it's going to be reflected in the policy. But the thing is, claims like humans are hyperbolic discounters, they're true, right? They describe most of us, but it's only true in a generic sense. And there's exceptions, right? And I think those exceptions leaves room for optimism, right? There are those rare people who are not subject to psychological biases. We can think of these people as visionaries, and it's in them, not collective enterprises, that I place my hope for space colonization. Now, that naturally will lead to its own set of ethical challenges, but we can talk about that in another time. Thank you very much.